Hello, all. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining the Cloud and Technology User Group this month's meeting. So we will be kind of recording this session. So if you choose not to be recorded, you may disconnect now. Okay. I'd like to introduce the host for this afternoon. The host for this afternoon is Dr. Derek Stanford. He holds a PhD in statistics from University of Washington. His background includes working on predictive models and data science for companies in financial services and aerospace manufacturing. He is currently CTO at Keeper AI. Dr. Stanford also serves as a state senator in the Washington State Legislature. Dr. Stanford, welcome. I request you to take it from here.
Thank you very much, Jagadesh. I am excited to be here today with a special guest. Our guest is Steve Coons, who is IT Director for the Tax Commission, the Utah State Tax Commission. He has been an IT director. He's been working for the state of Utah for 36 years, so significant institutional knowledge of their systems there. And he's going to give us an overview of a recent cloud migration project that they did with the Tax Commission. And then we will dive in and discuss details. After that, we will have a Q&A session, so feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go. And we'll probably work some of those into the discussion. And at the end, you can ask questions live in our Q&A session. So Steve Coons, welcome, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. As was said, I'm Steve Coons. I'm the IT director here. I've been the IT director for the Tax Commission for 9 years and was involved in IT management here for many years before that. In terms of the cloud migration, we'll kind of set this scenario, I guess, a little bit. In the fall of 2019, we were examining the result of our early 2019 legislative session, and one of the decisions made by the legislature was to tear down the data center the state had behind the state capitol. The reasoning for that was so they could build more parking and a museum, and they also planned to tear down the state office building and purchased a new building and data center after that. But at this early stage, we knew that this was coming and that our critical systems at the Tax Commission, which include obviously tax and revenue, and we are a fast enterprise client, so this was Gentax on the tax and revenue side, and we also had the vehicle system from FAST. We're responsible for vehicle titling and registration at the Tax Commission in Utah. So we had these two large applications there that were critical to the agency, and looking at the speed the Central Technology Agency here in Utah was moving on the data center relocation, I wasn't very comfortable with just moving the systems to a new data center. So I began exploring options. I spoke with FAST. I looked at their offerings. We looked at other cloud services, although our expertise in Utah at that point was all with AWS, with a cloud team we had. So after, as I say, exploring this with FAST and looking at costing and other things, we determined that the best course forward was to relocate these applications to the AWS cloud. As part of that process, then we decided we would move the vehicle system first, and we were migrating to a new version of Gentax in 2020, or a new version of FAST product for vehicle in 2020, and we coordinated our move with that process, and we did that for a number of reasons, but the primary one was that we had a lot of testers available during that migration throughout the year. So starting in January, February, we built our development environment small as that was, in AWS, and began making sure firewalls were configured. And then when we built the test environment, and as testing went live and users were involved, they were testing in AWS. We maintained a parallel site, a parallel process on-prem, but the users were all testing in AWS. And we looked at this at this stage as a proof of concept, because we wouldn't make a go live decision in AWS until much further down in the process. So as we went through with the users and testing, one of the things we didn't do is tell the users that we were in AWS. I wanted a cleaner report from them on performance and how the system was behaving. Their management knew we were doing it, but most of the users and testers did not. So we went forward and had a successful process through the test environment. We moved to our UAT, or staging environment, later in the spring, and again in AWS, and that also worked quite well. So as we approached the end of that, we stood up a production environment and did extensive testing in production behind the scenes to make sure it behaved the same way. And in October of that year, we cut over to production in AWS. We've been there now right at 2 years. We did this in Columbus Day of 2020, and I've had no performance problems or real issues with the Amazon environment doing that. So following that success, we felt a little more comfortable in doing the revenue piece. So we were not doing that in conjunction with a major version upgrade, but we did it with a service pack upgrade, again, so we had testers readily available at each stage. And we went through the same dev, test, staging, production process in the Gentex revenue environment. We started that in January of 21, went live in June of 21, and have been running there for a little over a year now. One full cycle with income tax in particular, although all of our taxes are in that system, but our income tax system performed very well during the filing season last year, and yeah, things have been good in that regard. So it was an interesting process. We had a lot of involvement, particularly in the beginning, interaction with our vendor, FAST, and they came out and talked to us. They helped us size the environment, the EC2 instances, and the different components that we needed there. We spent a lot of time working on making sure we had the right firewall rules in place so people had good access to the system. And that was probably one of the bigger struggles we had. It isn't trivial to move the amount of data we have in our systems, even though we're a smaller state, from on-prem into the cloud, getting it up there in the first place. And certainly for a production cutover was a little bit of a challenge, but we were able to navigate that and get things in place. I don't know, at the technical level, as we moved the databases, we stood the new ones up. We moved all of our data ahead of time, and then we did a daily incremental backup restore in the cloud. So when it came time to do cutover, we weren't doing any dramatic changes. So that's, I guess, the highlight of what we did, kind of an overview of what we did. We had the good luck that we had a web-based system to begin with in Gentex, so and dealer systems. So it wasn't, we weren't re-architecting, we were moving and forklifting, if you want to call it that, these resources into the cloud, re-provisioning them as different kinds of servers. The cost is always an issue when you're doing this. And cost is a hard thing to address because if you're talking about state agencies, or different states, everybody seems to charge differently for IT resources. And so doing an apples to apples comparison is difficult. We in Utah, the central IT service decided at the time we were doing this that they were going to do a 25% surcharge on all of our cloud activities to kind of equalize the cost with the data center that they were still dealing with and the loss there in revenue there as we moved. With my estimates on this, even with the 25% surcharge, we broke even going to Amazon. So it was in essence 25% less expensive. I know that my estimates were off a little bit, but not dramatically. The agency finance people will still speak to me, so that's probably a good sign that I didn't go too far off. But we have also been able to restructure over the years, the year or more we've been there, 2 years in vehicle, and change a little bit the way we do our database backup and reliance, and save some money there. We're currently running, one of the big wins out of this was I think resiliency and disaster recovery, however you want to term that, where we have the application servers and the database servers split across multiple availability zones in the Amazon GovCloud West region. So it's a clustered database server, and one node is in one availability zone, the other in another, and the application servers are split likewise. We don't see any delays or latency as a result of that change, and we were pretty pleased with that, and that's worked quite well. We have since I guess the next point there, with while we're talking about the database servers, I also moved the licensing on the SQL Server database servers from a traditional licensing mechanism to Amazon's on-demand SQL Server licensing. That is slightly more costly than the traditional method, but it does allow us to adjust our servers in near real time. We do have to restart a server to adjust, but we can seasonally or whatever the need might be, scale up or scale down database servers. And so once we were in that position where we had that working, we were able to take the secondary nodes of our clusters and make them smaller and save some money there, because we knew if we had to fail over with a 5-minute change at the failover, we could scale those servers up to provide the same service as the production, as the full-fledged servers. And that was a substantial cost savings being able to do that. I think my largest production database servers, I think 32 cores, and everything is charged by the core, the licensing and everything else. So being able to scale that secondary down to 8 cores, obviously a 75% savings there for us. So that was good. Trying to think, what am I missing here? Staff has been very happy with this. Our support staff has not grown. I support this with 3 DevOps people doing the server administration and provisioning. I don't have a large development staff here outside, a small DBA staff, and I don't know, about 17 developers in total across the 2 systems. We do have fast developers on site as well, but we did before, and that hasn't changed. And as I said earlier, Fast was very supportive in this, and largely the underlying infrastructure, the Amazon portion, we manage that ourselves with the assistance of some of our cloud center here at the state.
Okay. Thank you. So that's a great overview with a lot of details. So that was really helpful. So at a high level, it sounds like you were able to take a very deliberative, thoughtful approach to this migration. It wasn't being rushed, and you had the resources to be able to put a lot of effort into the sort of exploration and planning stage, before you even got to a decision of whether you were actually going to go through and make the switch. And because of that, you were able to not only work out a lot of issues, but really minimize the impact on users. And like you mentioned, not even telling them or trying to, not even make it an issue for them at all. So that's a huge contrast with a lot of other similar projects where the users really have to change a lot of what they do. So being able to take those steps, do all of that work up front, then you kind of guarantee a good smooth delivery after that. I wanted to mention the data center issue. So here in Washington State, of course, we had a state data center as well, with some similar issues. I guess I won't editorialize, but just some issues around that, and what state agencies wanted to do or were tasked with doing. But it sounds like that was kind of the motivating factor that moved this originally, was that you had to move out of the data center that you were in, and so then that started this process. So as you went through that, then you were essentially trying to just make sure nothing got worse.
Yes.
And so cost didn't get worse. The functionality, the users were not being unduly impacted. But then at the end of that, you end up with a lot more options for functionality and for potential cost savings as you kind of settle into that.
Yeah, we were looking throughout the process. You're exactly right. When it comes to cost and performance and functionality for the users, the baseline was it had to be at least as good as what we were using at the time. Any benefit we got out of it was a bonus, and that proved to be true on all fronts. I mean, from a cost, it was relatively level, and certainly performance was better, and yeah. The users, that seemed to be very flat. They didn't experience any problems with this. Yeah.
So the collaboration tools and team working tools that your users had before are pretty much the same now,
Yeah.
as they were previously. So I usually would ask about how you worked to minimize the impacts on users, but I think you minimized as much as could possibly be done. On the administrative side, with your DevOps team and coders, did you need to do any training there, or how did you kind of deal with that skill set of dealing with the Amazon cloud? And I think you said Fast was the only vendor that you were essentially working with on this, so you didn't have other external consultants helping you through this, just
No.
Fast and your own folks.
Primarily my own team, and with some input from Fast. And yeah, the training in terms of the DevOps team, well, we did need to do some training, and this relates, I think, to one of the questions in the chat when they're asking about infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. This was basically infrastructure as a service is the way we approached it. And as we went into this, we're currently manage this, that my DevOps team is managing this as infrastructure as code. So they're using Terraform scripting to provision, which is maybe a little technical, I don't know. Some may want to know that. And there was training involved with that, obviously. There was training involved with just understanding the environment in Amazon and how to provision and what we needed there. We did that because of the nature of how we did the project. Many of these things our team members were working with slightly more experienced cloud team members at the beginning of this, and they were able to work with them and shadow them and then take over as we created these. And that's why we created the environments. Part of the reason, part was cost, but creating them one at a time is it gave them multiple opportunities to provision an environment in the Amazon area. I mean, they did it with a small number of devices in a test dev region. They did it with a much larger version in the staging UAT version, and then again with production. So they learned at every step. And as I pointed out, teaching them how to work in Amazon with experienced DevOps people was not terribly difficult. Some of the tools were different, the methodologies were a little different, but that seemed to work out quite well. The networking functionality and getting things stood up and the firewalls configured correctly, that was more of a challenge, honestly. But again, that's a very mechanical, functional process. It's just getting everything right and identifying everything and making sure. And that's where doing it as we had extensive testers identified any holes we might have. We were right in the middle of COVID, and so as we were doing this, very soon we learned to make all the changes we needed to make with all of our users working on a VPN. So that they could get to this and some of those things as well.
And what about ongoing? Do you have like a formal training program, or is it kind of like an organic, like people just sort of learn what they need as they go, or how do you approach that?
Well, with the DevOps guys, that's where most of the training will be. We have done some formal training with other technical staff or DBAs and so forth on how they're allowed to interact with these servers, what tools they use to interact with these servers. So we do training around that. The DevOps group is more organic. As we've added people, we work them into the process and assign them some training that we use Pluralsight, which is an online training thing, give them some work there, have them start doing simple things and building things, and working through that process.
So since the functionality was, as you made the transition, you're essentially just transitioning your Gentac system from on-prem to the cloud. So you didn't have any big changes in architecture. You didn't change your database or anything like that. But now that you're there, you talked a little bit about some of the infrastructure functionality that's improved now in the way that you can manage that. Do you see this opening the door to other functionality in your applications, or do you see anything on the horizon in terms of changes there?
Well, some of that is limited by what the vendor does and what they make available to us, and we are certainly open to that. We made the changes I spoke about earlier, where we changed the way our databases were licensed that allowed us to scale a little better. We made changes a little bit to how we do application servers, where perhaps we sized them differently and didn't have as many as we did on-prem, knowing that we can, in an emergency, it's far easier to spin something up and bring it into play than before. One of the architectural changes that I don't know, forget or gloss by, the way we access the application obviously has changed because we're in the cloud. It's still a web application for the users, but we use, the Amazon tools. We transition from traditional load balancing applications to load balancers in AWS. We change once we get inside our cloud environment there. We're using the Amazon equivalent of firewalls around each server to secure it. We're using Amazon's web application filters to do things like geo-blocking and other security measures. So yeah, some of those things changed as we did it, and some of that has evolved. Some of it we didn't do initially, and we've added as we went along. I am pleased that we use RiskSense security scoring as a tool here at the state. Our security group does, and I don't know. I think their current goal is to get all their servers a RiskSense score, which is done. It's a Nessus scan, and based on whether you've applied the appropriate CVEs or so forth. And they're shooting for a goal of over 600 on all the servers, with higher being better. Our servers in AWS are, except for the days after patches are released, routinely run in the 800 range. It's easier, I think, to patch. My DevOps guys agree that it is. We have more tools to look at things in that regard. And I don't know if I mentioned, we are running in GovCloud and not commercial cloud in Amazon. So yeah, I don't know if that answered everything you asked, Derek. But
so continuing on the security line, have you seen kind of at a higher level, have you seen a lot of changes in the security issues that you're dealing with over the past few years? Is this something that you see evolving quickly? And I mean, I would assume that, as you just described, being on the cloud kind of makes it easier to update and adapt to that as you go.
Yeah, that's very much true. And we do see an emerging and changing threatscape here. I was in a meeting with the centralized IT security team yesterday, the CISO for the state, and he was talking about threats and the increase in that. And certainly this time of year, many states are seeing a dramatic increase in threats because elections are coming up, and that is always a time when the threat posture changes and things increase. We have seen it be much easier. There are tools in AWS that allow us to be more proactive with some of these things. I mean, some of those you can buy on-prem and use, and even some of the Amazon ones we're now extending and using on-prem for many agencies because they're easy to use. But yeah, that is changing over time, and we are increasing. I think one other thing I had to mention, for those of you who've been involved with revenue agencies before, we have an every 3-year visit from the IRS to do what they term a safeguard review, what most people would term an audit. We just finished our first safeguard review since our transition to Amazon. We don't have the complete detail yet, but we didn't have any critical findings in AWS from the IRS. They seemed relatively happy with our configuration and deployment. Our initial score was right at 80% of theirs, but the safeguard review is so recent, I haven't seen the detail. They haven't given us the detail on that yet for me to look in and see what changes we needed to make. The two changes they highlighted were minor configuration issues that had been done, actually one by the centralized security group where they hadn't configured an S3 bucket correctly for transferring logs, and that was probably the major one we had. So yeah, I think our security posture has improved as a result of this, and I will say that the agency executive director here at Tax very much feels that that's true. He feels that we're much more secure than we were before.
Excellent. So you mentioned dealing with FAST as your main vendor on this. There are several Washington state agencies that are customers of FAST as well. A lot of making sure a project goes right is managing your vendor or vendors. being able to monitor the progress, being able to have contracts that that really get to making sure you get what you want to get. So could you talk a bit sort of in general about managing vendors in the IT world and anything specific about this project as well?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing, and it's changing a lot. I had a conversation with the security lead here at Tax actually this morning about vendor contracts and IRS requirements for vendor contracts, and how this recent review highlighted some changes. I used to, and I still do with FAST, we have a contract with FAST directly, but other vendors, for example, our AWS contract is not directly with AWS. We use the NASPO level contracts, which is the National Association of State Purchasing Organizations, or whatever, where they're doing a multi-state available contract, and we take part in that. So for example, my AWS contract is owned by Software House International, and then the AWS is a part of that. My contract we use Gmail here. My contract with Google is owned by Carahsoft, which many of you, they're the reseller there. And so this provides many challenges. I mean, you don't have as much direct input into the terms of the contract. Sometimes those are already pre-negotiated. I mean, we have some, but there are some things that are left out. And in some cases, I know we had quite a few discussions initially with Carahsoft, given that the contract with AWS, or I'm sorry, with SHI was with them. And then we were contracting with them, just making sure that the overall account was set up so they didn't actually have any access to any of the state's accounts in AWS, because that isn't traditional. If you're the owner of the contract, you have access to the accounts. So that's quite a challenge. In terms of working with the vendors, I started very early exploring this with FAST. I was very straightforward and upfront with them about what I wanted to do, what I was exploring, the options I was looking at. And then as we made a decision, I was upfront with them about the decision that we made and how we were going to proceed, and actually involved them in every stage of the planning. And I think that's, when you're dealing with vendors, it's very important that they're involved in the planning. Obviously, they would be involved in the project, but I've had occasions before where we're transitioning a system where we brought a VP from one of the vendors in and had them sit in our stakeholders meetings and be involved and understand the progress of the project. And in some cases that highlighted where their group was causing the project to slow down or maybe have some problems because they weren't providing things. And he's sitting there with the agency leads and others. And I've done that with vendors and also with other state agencies as they're involved in some of our projects. If it's a large project, when we did the vehicle system, we had the public safety director as part of our stakeholders as well, because of the really high level of interaction between public safety and the vehicle system and the things we were building, so that they were all aware of the deadlines, they were all aware of the problems. I think that's crucial that you do that.
That makes sense. So essentially communication and accountability, I mean, it's easy to say, but sometimes hard to do. But thank you. That's helpful. Okay, I think we're kind of getting toward our Q&A time here. There was one more question from the chat that we hadn't got to yet. How did you estimate the network capacity needed to ensure performance would meet the needs?
Well, we met with we looked at what capacity we were using into these systems before. We met with the networking and the cloud they've changed their name so many times, I don't know what to call them, the central cloud team at our central IT agency, and talked with them about bandwidth. We watched the bandwidth very closely as we scaled the systems up. During the process, the state determined to go with, because there were other agencies looking to go to AWS as well, 10 gig interconnect or direct connect was established, and eventually during the process it ended up being a redundant 10 gig interconnect or direct connect was established with AWS, and that's how we did that. And it's worked very well actually to this point.
Okay. So at this point, I'll invite the audience members. If you have a question you'd like to ask, you can raise your hand and I will call on you, or you can still put questions in the chat. So be thinking about that. Oh, we've got a question from Christopher Moore. Go ahead.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you. So to both of you, thank you for your time. These are valuable. So I work at the Washington State Department of Ecology. My question revolves around app dev, impact, custom software stuff. So Gentax and your vehicle system, maybe your vehicle system as well. It sounds like a vendor provided, application that sounds configurable to some degree, but you have on-site fast developers there as part of your 16, I think you said. Those other 16, first question, I guess, is that vehicle system a custom software developed app?
No, that is also a fast application.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, that's
No,
just my
you're fine.
ignorance on fast probably and what they provide. So are there integrations that had to move along with that the other app devs there on your group, needed to learn something or change the way they deployed things, or, this isn't a native cloud, starting
No.
point kind of thing. So did your app devs have much of an impact for all this?
They did, because you're right, we had to make changes to the APIs and different integrations there. The biggest problem we had, and it did take some effort and get them looking at it the correct way. There are areas where you're moving a lot of data around in this world, in tax and probably every application, but we're bringing scanned images and data in, and we're bringing check financial data in and importing that into the applications, bringing that in from external sources. And so dealing with the movement of this data to the cloud, dealing with the issues when you're moving large numbers of small files, like relatively small files like you get with images of tax returns and so forth, that's not trivial when you're going from on-prem to the cloud. Things tend to slow down when there are high numbers of small items. And we changed the way we did it. We changed the timing, we changed the way we picked the files up, and we were able to overcome those issues, because there was a slowdown and some issues in the beginning with Gentax more than than the vehicle system. We interact with I don't know if you have NIC in Washington. There have been, I think they've been purchased by Tyler now, but they're a vendor targeting state resources. They provide app development and a lot of different things. Over the years, they've been able to get the contract to do the web portion of our vehicle registration, the web update, which interacts through an API to our system. And they also have a payment portal that we've used initially by legislative mandate. So we had to make some changes with them and make sure that they were on board. It hasn't been a big lift yet. I know the agencies that are looking for a more cloud native solution, they've had to do a lot of work with training with their developers, or even hiring new developers to get that in place.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. There is another question in chat here. When the networking architecture for the user to cloud connectivity was evaluated and built, was testing conducted? Well, you can read the rest of the question there. It's fairly long.
Yes, we did. And we know that works because we had unfortunately, we had a network failure last week at a core component, a hardware failure that caused the entire state to go down for several hours. And even though the cloud systems were up, the users could not go directly to them, which may or may not be a benefit, but we do know that our network structure was working correctly in that case. And then the database question, I do not use RDS or SQL as a service now. We build our own cluster, but in AWS you can provision an EC2 instance with SQL pre-installed, and that's where you get to the on-demand SQL availability. So, and then you're charged like everything else in Amazon by the minute, second, whatever the charging model is for the SQL licensing as well as the EC2 instances, but they come as a package. We've looked at RDS. That's another level of cost. If we go with RDS, we're still exploring that because at some point I have an aging group of DBAs. So I either hire new DBAs to bring them in as we go along, or I see how much of this I can do with something like RDS and how does that cost transition. It's a difficult question. Honestly, things like this are difficult even to talk about with staff because they think you're trying to replace their job. And what I'm trying to do is bring them or prepare for when they are no longer available. And am I even going to get enough notice at some point to be able to hire somebody, or am I going to be, bringing a consultant in to help with the database for a while until we can get something else done? So yeah, that's what I've looked at there.
Okay. And Jagadish has posted some links in the chat to if you'd like to stay connected with our group on LinkedIn or be notified about other monthly events. We do have time for maybe a couple more questions. I will ask one. So a lot of the effort that went into this project kind of before the actual migration happened, we talked earlier about how there was a lot of that upfront planning, testing, setting up the dev environment. Can you talk about how that works with the reality of budget cycles in state government? And essentially my question is, I mean, I think a lot of people would say, yeah, I'd love to do all of that upfront, but how do I get funding for that without getting funding for the whole project and committing to it? So can you talk a bit about how that worked for you?
Yeah, sleight of hand? No, because really the reality is, and I think everybody realizes this if they think about it, you're running double systems. You're creating a system in the cloud. You're still paying for the resources on-prem until you actually make the transition. And honestly, for a little bit after that, you're still paying for them until everybody's comfortable the new system works and you can shut it off. So you're paying twice. I had a lot of discussions with the agency and again, the budget officer at the agency and let them know that that was what we were doing. I also worked with Amazon and I was able to get some credits there for this as we moved and did it as a proof of concept, and they were very, very generous in that regard, and that helped. I split it across fiscal years, so they didn't take the bite all in 1 year of running double. Yeah, I mean, it's all, you're right. It is all about budget planning. And I think this is another area where you have to be very transparent and interact with the budget side of the house a lot on this, because it's very real. I mean, you're going to start getting a bill for, you know, these very large servers and very large number of servers, and you're still getting a bill for the same servers in the old environment. So yeah, that's how I dealt with it. I do very much appreciate Amazon's assistance in this, though, with the credits that we received on this.
Great, thanks. It's obviously not a technical question, but nonetheless kind of a key part of making these projects work. Actually getting the budget to work for it, and having the vendors help as well certainly makes it easier. A couple more questions in the chat. Did you start with a direct connect before going live in production, or did you decide you needed it once it became obvious you needed it?
We decided and had that in place before we went live in production, and the first direct connect in place. We didn't get the redundancy until later, but we did. And we were the first agency, I think, to go live in AWS at the state. Over the next 3 or 4 months after we took vehicle there, some of the human services applications at the state went live, and some of the public safety applications. So the networking team at the state knew that there was more than just us, and they were planning for the capacity beyond that. The second question is very good. Are we planning to modernize these? That is a really excellent question. And some of the other agencies have done that, modernized them as they move them. Some are modernizing them after they move them. We're working with our vendor, and we're hoping to see some changes there. I mean, we move hand in hand with them because of the applications that we have in this primary one. I would say on the peripheral side, we're doing something a little more there. You know, I mentioned the scanning things that we're doing, and our scanning system, I don't know, it's only about 10 years old, the piece that we have, but we're doing scanning and OCR, and, you know, the recognition and identifying the form, and extracting data from various forms, even as we try to cut down. Well, because we're trying to cut down on the amount of paper, and we're pushing toward more e-filing, the cost of the scanning environment and its complexity goes up. And so now we're looking at what we can do with native AI and robotic process automation tools inside of Amazon to move these images up and have a system that can learn these forms more quickly and extract data more reliably. And that is kind of a prototype we're working on this year to see, can we move to this? Because I think it's much more cost efficient than our existing system, and in the long term might really give us some great results. So some of those things you work on afterwards as you can. And like I say, on modernizing the system and changing the architecture, we're somewhat reliant on our vendor on that.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, that's probably a good note to end on, talking about good things to come in the future, more functionality and more abilities. And we're just about at time anyway. So I would like to thank our audience and thank Steve Coons. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us, and congratulations on a very successful move to the cloud. And I really appreciate your comments, especially on kind of how to manage these things so that you get to a good result without too many bumps along the way, on the budget side as well as the technical side. So thanks very much for being here, and I will turn it back over to Jagadish.
Sure. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Derek, for sharing your experience. Can you see my screen? You should see an announcement slide.
Yep, we see it.
Excellent. I just want to kind of bring it out. Some of these links are already posted in the chat. So the monthly event actually happens almost every last Thursday. So you can stay up to date by visiting that link. And we always welcome volunteers and any nomination to be for presenting in the user group. So feel free to reach out to us using the contact us option in the website. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, we obviously have a LinkedIn group. The link is posted as well. And feel free to use the LinkedIn group to continue the conversation or ask additional questions. And of course, you will be included in the mailing list for any further events as well. So with that, I would like to also thank our supporting organizations here, Microsoft, Amazon AWS, Project Management Institute of Olympia, and CodeSmart. Thank you for their sponsorship. And again, thank you everyone for joining this session. Really appreciate it. Thank you.